The clamor of morning bells rang throughout the hallways of Lincoln High, echoing off the faded brick walls and linoleum floors. A low hum of student chatter filled the air, interspersed with bursts of laughter and the occasional shout. It was a typical Tuesday morning and nobody expected anything out of the ordinary. But ordinary would not be the word to describe what lay ahead that day, for a new teacher was coming, a substitute who was far from typical. First period English was already in session when a knock came at the door. Mrs. Barrett, the usual teacher, had called in sick for the first time in 10 years, leaving the students in a mix of surprise and relief. They had hoped for an easy day with a substitute, perhaps someone who would let them watch movies or play on their phones. Instead, as the classroom door creaked open, a figure stepped inside that instantly drained the lighthearted atmosphere from the room. "Good morning, class. I'm Mr. Crow," said the substitute, his voice deep and unsettlingly smooth, like a gust of wind that howled through an old, creaky house. He was tall and pale, his features sharp and gaunt. His eyes, a piercing shade of green, scanned the room with an intensity that made every student shift uncomfortably in their seats. His attire was oddly formal, an outdated black suit, pressed and pristine, which contrasted sharply with the casual vibe of the high school environment. From the moment he entered, something felt off. The air seemed to grow colder and the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly. The students exchanged glances, silently communicating their unease. Mr. Crow didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. "Your regular teacher has left specific instructions for today's lesson," he began, his eyes locking onto each student one by one. "But I believe we'll start with a little writing exercise, something creative." He moved behind the teacher's desk with an unnatural grace, his long fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden surface. The students watched in silence as he pulled out a leather-bound notebook and opened it, revealing blank pages that seemed to absorb the light. There was no visible label, no school logo, just plain dark leather. "We'll do something different," Mr. Crow continued, his lips curling into a faint smile that sent shivers down the students' spines. "I want you all to write a short story about your worst fear. It must be detailed. The more vivid, the better." The students hesitated, the classroom hanging in an uncomfortable silence. Writing about fears wasn't new. Mrs. Barrett had occasionally assigned similar prompts, but the way Mr. Crow had phrased it, with a subtle emphasis on vivid, made them feel exposed, vulnerable. Yet, as if under a spell, they all picked up their pens and began to write. Minutes ticked by as the students scribbled away, trying to capture their nightmares on paper. Some wrote about failing grades, others about losing loved ones. A few described more abstract fears, endless darkness, suffocation, being lost in a void. Mr. Crow walked slowly among the desks, occasionally stopping to glance at their writing with a look of profound interest. When he reached Sarah's desk, he paused. Sarah, the quiet girl who usually kept to herself, had written about a recurring nightmare where she was trapped in a house with no exits, doors that led to nowhere, and windows that showed only darkness. Mr. Crow's eyes gleamed as he read her words, and for a moment it looked as if he whispered something under his breath. Sarah shivered involuntarily and glanced up at him. "Is something wrong?" she asked hesitantly. "No, not at all," he replied smoothly, a cryptic smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "In fact, it's quite compelling." He continued his circuit around the room, finally returning to the front. "Now, place your stories in this notebook," he instructed, opening the leather-bound tome and laying it on the teacher's desk, one by one. Reluctantly, each student approached the desk, placing their written fears into the book. As soon as the story touched the pages, it seemed to melt into the paper, disappearing from view. The students exchanged nervous glances, a sense of foreboding settling over them. What kind of notebook was this? When the last story was placed in the notebook, Mr. Crow closed it with a decisive thud that echoed through the classroom. "Excellent," he said, his voice now tinged with an unsettling satisfaction. "Your fears are now mine." A nervous laugh escaped from a student in the back row. What, like you're gonna read them and scare us? He joked, trying to break the tension. Mr. Crow's gaze snapped toward the student, his eyes boring into him with a chilling intensity. Something like that, he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried an edge of malice. The rest of the day unfolded like a nightmare. During the lunch break, the hallway chatter was filled with tales of strange occurrences. Anna, a junior, had suddenly found herself trapped in the gym storage closet, unable to open the door despite it being unlocked. Jake claimed he'd seen shadows moving in the corners of the library, shapes that shouldn't have been there. Others spoke of a deep cold settling in random areas of the school, areas that had been warm just moments before. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Sarah, who had written about the house with no exits, found herself alone in the restroom during the break. When she opened the door to leave, the hallway outside wasn't there. Instead, she was greeted by a narrow corridor of dark, peeling wallpaper, stretching endlessly in both directions. Panicking, she turned back into the restroom, but the walls had shifted. The stalls were now doors leading to nowhere. Her heart raced as she backed away, eyes darting frantically for an escape. It was exactly as she had described in her story. The fear she had written down was now her reality. Meanwhile, in the classroom, Mr. Crow continued teaching, unaffected by the chaos around him. When the bell rang for the final period, the students hesitated to leave, casting nervous glances at one another. The substitute looked up from his desk, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "You're free to go," he said, his voice dripping with an eerie calmness. "But remember, your fears are with me now." The students filed out slowly, their instincts screaming at them to run, but something held them back. A sense of doom, a feeling that they couldn't simply escape what had been unleashed. As they walked through the hallways, they noticed the lights flickering more frequently, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the school in an early twilight. Sarah finally emerged from the twisted hallway, disheveled and pale, her eyes wide with terror. "It's real," she gasped to the others, clutching her arms tightly around her. "The things we wrote, they're happening." A ripple of fear spread through the group. The students began to understand what Mr. Crow had done. By writing their deepest fears, they had given them life, a life that Mr. Crow now controlled. He wasn't just a substitute. He was something far darker, something that fed on their nightmares. The students gathered in the front courtyard, frantically discussing what to do next. Some wanted to confront Mr. Crow, while others wanted to flee and never return. Just then, the front doors of the school swung open, and Mr. Crow stepped out, holding the leather-bound notebook. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice carrying an unnatural echo. "But the lesson isn't over." He opened the notebook, and as he did, the air around them grew colder, the shadows lengthening across the courtyard. "You see, your fears are now part of this place," he continued, his eyes glinting with a sinister light. "You've given them form, substance, and they will remain here within these walls until I decide otherwise." Sarah stepped forward, her fear momentarily replaced by anger. "What are you?" she demanded. "Why are you doing this?" Mr. Crow tilted his head slightly, as if pondering the question. "I am simply a collector," he replied. "A collector of fears, of stories. And you, my dear students, have provided me with a most exquisite collection." With a wave of his hand, the notebook snapped shut, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Then, as if released from a spell, the lights in the school returned to normal, the air warmed, and the students found themselves standing in a perfectly ordinary school courtyard. "Go home," Mr. Crow said, his voice losing its eerie echo. "Your fears will remain here for now. But remember, they are never truly gone." He turned and walked back into the school, the doors closing behind him with a final, resounding thud. The students stared at the closed doors, a mixture of fear and confusion swirling in their minds. What had just happened? And more importantly, what did it mean for them? They didn't have answers, only the knowledge that Lincoln High was no longer just a school. It had become a repository of their fears, all bound within the pages of a mysterious notebook held by a substitute who was anything but human. As they slowly made their way home, one thought plagued each of their minds. What would happen when Mr. Crow returned, and what new fears would he come to collect next time?